this evening is Jason Jarrell. And Jason Jarrell has been studying prehistoric civilizations and the Nephilim for 17 years. During the last 6 years, he and his wife Sarah have been involved in an independent investigation of the Adena culture of North American mound builders. Over the course of their research, they have studied over 100 years of literature, including archaeological reports from North America, Europe, and the ancient East, as well as the writings of 19th century antiquarians. Their work also involves investigations of lost or forgotten archaeological sites in Ohio, Kentucky, and the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia. Their conclusions are that gigantic skeletons connected with a colonizing Indo-European culture were discovered well over 100 years ago in the United States and subsequently concealed by a powerful transnational force. Sarah and Jason have published articles with the Ancient Origins website and Ancient American magazine, and their website is AlleghenyMounds.com. And please welcome Jason to the show this evening. Hello, Jason.
Hello. Thank you for bringing me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you on. Welcome. It's wonderful to have you on tonight, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. And of course, it sounds to me like you have a lot of information under your belt, and we're going to get started here. And let everybody know how you kind of got involved in this. I know this whole area that you've been investigating is actually in your neighborhood. You actually live there, right around it, don't you, with these mounds?
Well, we live at ground zero. For the prehistoric mound building culture that is known today as the Adena culture. And we initially learned that there was something interesting going on here because we were at a conference. It was a conference for political activists, actually. And there was another couple there, and they were telling us that several ancient sites existed in our area where the remains of gigantic skeletons had been found. And so we decided to look further into the matter, and here we are 6 years later, and it appears that they were right. And I myself, I've been studying the Nephilim and ancient history and ancient Mesopotamia and different cultures for a long time, and before we started this journey about 6 years ago, I'd always taken the North American giants concept with a grain of salt because there were a lot of newspaper articles, but I was unaware of how much archaeological literature that exists to back up these claims.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I was going to ask you also, now the mounds in the area, they were excavated by the Smithsonian in 1883. Is that correct?
Well, in 1883 and 1884, the Bureau of Ethnology of the Smithsonian surveyed and excavated a large number of works throughout the Kanawha Valley. In Charleston, West Virginia, there were between 40 and 50 mounds and between 8 and 10 sacred enclosures situated on the north and south side of the Kanawha River. And these mounds, some of them were very small. Many of them were only 3 or 4 feet high, but others were between 30 and 40 feet high. And the sacred enclosures, most of them were what we would classify as a Class 1 henge if they were found in Western Europe. In fact, a couple of them were over 600 feet in circuit, and the outer walls were 10 feet high. They would include an inner ditch with an opening that was usually aligned to some type of celestial or solar event. And in 1883 and 1884, the Smithsonian sent an agent named Colonel Norris to excavate the mounds and earthworks in the Kanawha Valley. And there's actually a publicly available version of those reports in the 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology. And you can actually read in that document, which is a document produced by the Smithsonian itself, about the gigantic skeletons that their own agent discovered in West Virginia, as well as many other states. There's many states in that report. And I think that the number is there are around 17 gigantic skeletons that are actually measured in that report.
Wow, that's quite a few. And of course, what happened to these skeletons?
Well, there are a lot of theories as to exactly what happened to the skeletons. One of the manuscripts that we've reviewed extensively in our research is the handwritten notebook, the day-to-day diary of the agent of the Smithsonian that excavated the mounds in Charleston. And the details of that manuscript described how most of the skeletons excavated in Charleston turned into dust when they attempted to remove them from the tomb, and others, they could remove them from the tombs, but when they attempted to pack them up and ship them back to the Smithsonian, they turned to dust. But there are gigantic skeletons which have been claimed and preserved and concealed. And our research has revealed that it may not be the Smithsonian which has primarily operated to conceal these remains. We do not believe these remains are sitting in the Smithsonian vault. Because if you look at many of the accounts of the mound excavations that appear in newspapers in the 1900s, they're very popular. You can find many of them online right now. If you read closely, you'll see that in the 1900s, it was the philanthropies who were primarily excavating the mounds with the gigantic skeleton. You'll see the name Carnegie appear very often.
Mm-hmm.
So it's possible that the gigantic skeletons are in the possession of some very powerful and influential people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tend to believe that also. Yeah, private investors come to mind also. And when you go ahead.
Well, you mentioned private investors. For some reason, and it may have a lot to do with the scientific climate of the 20th century and what we're seeing today with people like Ray Kurzweil. We have encountered individuals in our research because we travel a lot, and when you see certain names mentioned in some of the articles that mention gigantic skeletons, we actually attempt to find a lot of these people or their living descendants. And it has been communicated to us on occasion that when these remains are found, private investors have purchased the remains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all hearing about that. That's kind of frustrating, too. Do you think they've been doing some reverse engineering? Or any type of insidious experimentation with that? Well,
most of the research that we're doing focuses on the evidence in the archaeological record for the existence of these beings. But there certainly are many reasons why these remains will be claimed. For one thing, it allows the people with power to determine what our worldview is, and it also allows them, the most important thing is it allows them to fabricate prehistory. Because the occupation of the Western world today, and we know that our economic system is occupied, we know that our political system is occupied, we know that our medical system is occupied. But what makes all this possible is that our history also is occupied.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who control history control the present.
Right. Very true. Yep, absolutely. Well, I know there was a remnant of what they would say are human sacrifices found in these mounds. Is that correct?
Well, to begin with, if you were to study the writings of the Antiquarians of the 1800s, many of the mounds were interpreted as containing altars and proof of human sacrifice. And then what happens is, in the modern age, it's probably a symptom of political correctness. When sites of this culture are excavated and there's any evidence of sacrifices or things of that nature, they interpret it to mean that it's a mortuary processing facility. In other words, if they excavate a timber hinge, and the Adena culture did build timber hinges, like the wood hinge that's so famous in Western Europe. If they excavate a timber hinge and they find the skeletal remains of dozens of individuals, well, that's not a sacrifice. That's interpreted as mortuary processing of the dead. Mm. So it's a question of whether you trust in the interpretations of people who were simply observing what they saw, or if you trust in the interpretations of people today who essentially are operating under certain mandates.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Now,
go ahead.
There is a mound in Charleston, and it's known as, today it's in a place called the Shawnee Park in South Charleston. And what most people don't realize today about that mound was when it was excavated by the Smithsonian, it was found to be composed almost completely of ashes and bones. And inside that mound, there were two very large skeletons, and they were positioned in burial so that they were facing each other with their arms raised. And they were holding a sandstone basin, and inside of it were burnt human remains. And directly beneath these skeletons was an altar, and there were more burnt bones, cinders on the altar. And nearby this mound, on a mountaintop, there's a location that the Smithsonian recorded as Point N, and it was a 61-foot-long pile of the bones of women and children. So one possible interpretation is that this was a sacrificial site.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, it sounds like some kind of ceremony was going on, that's for certain. It's very interesting.
Well, these people they transformed, we're talking about the Kanawha Valley primarily right now, but they transformed the entire state of West Virginia. There are sites throughout the entire state that we found most of them were never professionally excavated. It's the early historians that recorded many of them, and a surprising number of these sites are megalithic sites.
Mm-hmm. Right. And they're still not investigating any of these?
Well, if they're being investigated, many of the sites that we've studied, no one's talking about them. Mm-hmm. And, of course, development destroyed an unbelievable number of ancient earthworks in the Ohio River Valley. In fact, most of the archaeological work that was done in the 20th century was probably just of the remnant that was left over. But initially, if you had seen the United States of America, the entire region east of the Mississippi River 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, the entire landscape was transformed with earthworks, burial mounds, and megalithic construction.
Mm-hmm. Pretty fascinating. That's pretty cool. What about ground-penetrating radar? Has anyone used any of that, do you think?
No one has used that in West Virginia. Okay. I know that when it's used at sites in Ohio and Kentucky, they find that there are traces of these circular enclosures that were never even seen, meaning that there were earthworks that had been built and disappeared possibly hundreds and hundreds of years before the first colonists were even in North America, because they're not even on record. Mm-hmm. So that would certainly be an interesting endeavor.
Oh, yeah.
Would be to use, because one of the things that's become apparent in recent years, now if you were to use generic sources like pamphlets or textbooks, you would probably find that this culture we're talking about is usually dated to around 500 BC. And that's because in the 1960s, archaeologists developed a system of cultural succession, and when they placed a culture somewhere in the chronology of North America, it was very difficult for subsequent researchers to offer any evidence which contradicted what was already set in stone. But recently, in the Kanawha Valley, the pottery of the Adena culture has been discovered at sites like the Cocoa Station site, which is actually near the Kanawha Valley Mounds and was dated in context back to 1375 BC. There's a site in Putnam County where a species of Adena pottery was dated to 1290 BC.
Mm.
And in Ohio, at the Siemens Fort site, it's been dated to 1448 BC. The Hoffaker site, it was dated to 1997 BC, and at the Bremen site, it's been dated to 2547 BC. So unless we're willing to accept that the pottery is 2,000 years older than the mounds within which it's usually found in sherds, in broken pieces, this culture is actually thousands of years older than mainline sources are at the present willing to admit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. That's really amazing. And also, I wanted to get a little bit into the shell mounds. Can you describe those for the listeners who aren't familiar with that?
Well, the shell mound archaic is known primarily from Kentucky. And shell mounds in the United States, a lot of them date to around 4,000 4,500 BC. But they are found in earlier contexts, and the shell mounds are from an earlier period. This is from the Middle Archaic period in North America. Okay. So this is a predecessor culture to the earthen and conical mound building Adena. Mm-hmm. And certain traits of the shell mound culture actually persisted into the Adena period, because there's at least one shell mound that's documented from Charleston amidst the Adena earthworks. Now, the shell mound archaic, the shell mound people, it's become apparent in recent years they were connected to several other Middle Archaic cultures because they found copper artifacts in limited quantities in some of the burials inside these shell mounds. And this copper came from Lake Superior and was probably associated with the earlier phase of the old copper industry in Lake Superior. And there's actually another archaeological horizon in Iowa and Illinois and Missouri that's known as the Helton phase, which was also associated with the shell mound archaic. So essentially, the prehistory of North America looks like two major cultural entities which covered roughly the same geographic expanse, and these cultures appeared in succession. And what's very interesting is that if you look at the chronology, the Middle Archaic period in North America corresponds roughly with the Neolithic period of Western and Eastern Europe. And during the Neolithic period of Western and Eastern Europe, there are shell mounds containing burials that are virtually identical to those in North America. And this is a time period that's contemporaneous with the Long Barrow people and the earlier megalithic people in Europe. And then in the Bronze Age, the burial mounds and earthworks in Western Europe are virtually identical to the Adena culture in North America. So there's a cultural sequence mm-hmm. in both areas divided by the Atlantic Ocean that mirror each other.
Right. That's quite fascinating. Yeah. You've done a lot of extensive research on this, I can tell, and I so appreciate you being on tonight. We can go in so many different directions with this. I did want to ask you, what kind of ancient artifacts, if at all, have been found at some of these mounds connected to the Adena?
Well, that's a great question. The Adena, this culture in the 1960s, there was a growth of what was known as the Adena taxonomy. And taxonomic lists were used by American archaeologists in the 20th century to sort of contain all the features and artifacts and traits of specific North American cultures. And by the 1960s, the Adena taxonomic list had actually grown to the point that many archaeologists began to say that there was no such thing as a specific Adena culture. And that's a result of the diversity, the sheer diversity of what was found in the Adena mounds and the different types of structures within the mounds and burial types. Now, the Adena, they had copper bracelets. Occasional copper knives have been found. They had slate and copper gorgets. The Adena also occasionally buried their chiefs with antler headdresses. These would be like a copper band with antlers attached, which the early antiquarians, who could identify what was right in front of their faces, they identified this as a trait of the ancient horned god in Western Europe, and in fact, many of the Scythian kings that were also buried in burial mounds were found with similar headdresses. So there's a great deal of diversity among Adena artifacts. For example, the Fisher Mound. When Don Dragu wrote about the Fisher Mound, he identified the artifacts in that mound as essentially the same as the old copper culture from the Great Lakes. But contrasting this, in Charleston, many of the mounds only had shell beads and occasional copper bracelets. So with the artifacts and the types of burials, what we're actually looking at are regional trends among different elite lineages. So the mounds in specific regions may have similar artifacts and similar burial styles, while other Adena mounds in a different region may demonstrate differing trends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty interesting right there. Why do you think the professional archaeologists kind of deny the importance of the Adena in general?
Well, today the professional archaeologists are attempting to go on record with this completely ludicrous idea that there's no such thing as an Adena culture. And I've seen this in several archaeological journals, and I'm frankly surprised by some of the people who are saying this, because they're actually respectable scholars. Mm-hmm. And one of the number one reason for the archaeologists is the diversity. They can't comprehend why there's so much diversity in Adena mounds. And the other reason is there's a force somewhere that has always had a deep interest in how archaeologists interpret the Adena culture. And I can give you a great example of that from the Depression era. Mm-hmm. During the Depression era, one of the stimulus packages that was passed was to finance archaeology in North America. And a lot of people are unaware of this. But at the time, if you wanted federal funding to do archaeological research as an archaeologist, there were certain stipulations that you had to obey when you did research on the Adena culture. And those stipulations all had to do with the origins and the age of the culture. For example, they weren't looking for people to find evidence that the Adena were any older than 1000 BC. And when it came to interpretive guidelines, you essentially had to go with the idea that if these people came from somewhere else other than the Ohio River Valley, if they originated from somewhere else in the world, then that place had to be Mexico, because there's no such thing as ancient pre-Columbian contact in the central paradigm of American archaeology. And that's why if you read the works of William S. Webb, in the Adena People number 2, William S. Webb plainly connects the Adena culture to certain traits and artifacts that go back to 2500 BC in the Northeast. And yet he still maintains in the same book that the Adena culture must have come from Mexico. And the reason for that is he was offering the evidence that he actually found right alongside the paradigm which he was obligated to give lip service to. So there's a long tradition of government involvement in acceptable interpretations of this specific culture.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about this culture that someone with a lot of power has had a deep interest in for at least 150 years.
Right. And let me ask you something. For the listeners who may not be familiar with the term Adena, can you define that, and how do you define that name and the culture itself?
Well, the Adena culture is a name that's been given to the cultural entity which built thousands of burial mounds and earthworks in the Ohio River Valley. They have prominent manifestations in Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia. They were in Pennsylvania. And they essentially had connections to the Northeast. They've been found in Indiana. And that's a name that was given to this mound-building culture by Thomas Worthington. And the way that they received the name from Thomas Worthington was Thomas Worthington, who was the governor of Ohio between 1814 and 1818. On his estate, there were a series of earthworks and mounds of this culture, and he named his estate the Adena. And archaeologists latched onto this idea and perpetuated the concept that this was the Adena culture, and the people who were responsible for it were the Adena people. And there's a lot of different interpretations of what the name Adena actually means, but we have it on record from several mainstream sources. This isn't gold dust. This is actual mainstream archaeological papers, where in the 20th century it was well known and well understood that Worthington named this culture after the Hebrew word Adena, which means paradise. And what interests me a great deal about that is that there's another mound-building culture with this term attached to it. In the Persian Gulf, on the island of Bahrain, the burial ground of the ancient Sumerian, Mesopotamian chiefs and royalty is located. There are over 500,000 burial mounds on this island, and the ancient Sumerians called this place Dil Moon, which in their own language also means paradise.
Wow, very interesting. Very much so.
Well, the reason that there's so much interest around the Adena is that the early settlers, beginning just after the Revolutionary War, almost immediately began to discover the bones of gigantic humanoids as they developed the land. And almost every local town and county had an antiquarian or historian who documented these discoveries in local history books. According to the old accounts, these giants were by and large between 7 and 9 feet tall, with very large skulls, massive jawbones, and occasional extra or pathological dentitions. And sometimes they actually had double or even triple rows of teeth. Now, there do occur at a lesser frequency a series of gigantic skeletons in these histories between 9 and 12 feet tall, and we can discuss those in a minute. These gigantic remains were primarily being found in the burial mounds that today are associated with the Adena culture. Now, when the Eastern Mound Division of the Smithsonian conducted their excavations of multiple hundreds of mounds in the 1880s, they discovered these unique physical types and recorded them in their own reports. And one valuable aspect of that work today is that we now know which cultures produced many of the mounds in those reports, and it demonstrates that these gigantic types were actually present in the archaic period, the woodland period of the Adena culture, and then even later, and then eventually in the Mississippian period, because they found one in the Etowah Mounds in Georgia. In the early 1900s, the Smithsonian Institution initiated a policy of denial concerning the North American giants. At that point, the universities simply decided to follow the lead of the National Museum. So there was a real danger at that time that the giants would be permanently obfuscated from the record.
Mm-hmm.
But what actually occurred was that in the 20th century, the gigantic skeletons were actually rediscovered by professional archaeologists who documented and measured them in mainstream sources. And the premier scholar and field worker who actually defined what is known as the Adena mound building culture is William S. Webb, who we talked about earlier. And Webb worked for the University of Kentucky and excavated more Adena sites professionally than any other archaeologist from the 20th century. And Webb worked with a physical anthropologist named Charles Snow to reconstruct not only the Adena culture, but also their unique physical type. Webb and Snow studied hundreds of Adena skulls and concluded that there was a distinct physical type which was genetically separate from all other prehistoric peoples, including the Hopewell. And the features that are noted in their own reports are that these people had extremely high cranial vaults. They were brachycephalic with a cranial index of 89 to 92 on average, and some reaching 100. They had very prominent foreheads, very large brow ridges. The cheekbones had a forward and lateral prominence, and the upper and lower jawbone is described as prognathic, powerful, and very wide with a large bony chin. And these Adena are thought to have practiced occipital flattening, which is a form of artificial cranial deformation, through the use of an infant headboard. However, in the analysis of the skeletal material from the Wright Mounds in Kentucky, the anthropologist states, and this is a direct quote, "Deformed as they are, these crania show a pronounced brachycrany, which means a high vault, and skulls which were only of medium deformation still gave an index of over 90. And this anthropologist concluded that these people would have shown pronounced brachycrany even without deformation. And what that means to us is that the artificial cranial deformation, if it was practiced at all, was only heightening congenital features.
Mm-hmm.
Now, another feature of the Adena physical type that's on record is the occasional presence of supernumerary teeth. And these are referenced in the Adena people number 2, Webb, Snow, and Bobby. And specific examples include burial 54 at the Dover Mound, at least one burial from the Wright Mounds, and in more recent times, skeletons from McMurray Mound 1 and Sidner Mound 1 in Ohio. Now, there are sites on record with crania that feature either 4 or more sets of extra teeth or entire extra rows of teeth, and these have been found at Seaman's Fort in Ohio and the Price 3 Old Copper Culture site in Wisconsin. And these are all the basic traits of Adena people. And when Webb excavated the Dover Mound in Mason County, Kentucky, he encountered a group burial of 4 individuals near the top of the mound. And one of these was particularly noteworthy. And this is a quote from the excavation report. "The remains of burial 40 is one of the largest known to Adena. The skull-to-foot field measurement is 84 inches. Now, that's a 7-foot-tall skeleton.
Mm-hmm.
And the burial census table for the mound mentions that this skeleton had a very thick skull. And for other burials in the same mound, traits mentioned include prominent bilateral chin, rugged head and face, and high-vaulted, large-faced. Many of the females from the Dover Mound were 6 feet tall or over, and Webb concluded that the Dover Mound skeletons had the highest skull vaults reported anywhere in the world." Now, the next major Adena scholar, who was a mainstream archaeologist to encounter the gigantic physical type, was Don Dragoo. And Dragoo was an archaeologist who worked for the Carnegie Museum. He was chief curator of the Department of Anthropology. In 1963, Dragoo published Mounds for the Dead, which was his magnum opus on the Adena culture. The Mounds for the Dead included the details of Dragoo's excavations at the Cresat Mound in Marshall County, West Virginia, which were conducted in 1958. And in a subsurface tomb in the oldest layer of the mound, he encountered burial 54, and this is his description. This individual was of large proportions. When measured in the tomb, his length was approximately 7.04 feet. All the long bones were heavy and showed possessed marked eminences for the attachment of muscles. And a photograph of this skeleton in the tomb actually appears in Mounds for the Dead. Now, Dragoo determined that the gigantic among the Adena were an elite group which passed their features down for several generations. And he mentioned that two consistent, outstanding traits for those individuals were the massive jawbones and skeletons reaching 7 feet in height. Now, all the data which we've discussed from Webb, Snow, and Dragoo conforms to the details of the early histories and old newspaper accounts. The massive jaws, the excessive height, large skull vaults, and rugged musculature markings, as well as supernumerary teeth, are all confirmed features from mainstream sources for Adena skeletons. In other words, the work of William S. Webb and Don Dragoo validated the earlier accounts of the Antiquarians and put the gigantic skeletons on record, including measurements and photographs. And this was happening decades after the policy of denial had been instituted by the Smithsonian. And Dragoo mentioned in a chapter on physical anthropology, not only were these Adena people tall, but also the massiveness of the bones indicates powerfully built individuals. The head was generally big with large cranial capacity. So there's more of interest with these people than just the extreme height.
Right.
Their bones were thicker than our bones. Their skulls were larger and thicker, and their cranial capacity was higher.
Right. So let me ask you this. What do you think, or where do you think the origin of these beings came from? Now, I know your specialty is with the Nephilim. Or is there the connection to the Nephilim?
Well, if we're going to talk about origins, then we're going to have to go deep into prehistory. The ultimate origin of the mound building cultures and the gigantic skeletons that are attached to them actually goes deep into the distant past. And it goes back to Mesopotamia. The archaeologists today, there's an entire field of archaeology concerning some of the events that happened in prehistoric times in Mesopotamia. Between roughly 3800 and 3200 BC, there was actually a great empire which arose and covered vast portions of Europe and possibly North America. And the heart of this empire was in Mesopotamia, where a series of kings whose names are recorded on the Babylonian kings list as Utu, Megiakasher, and Enmerkar, which is the Sumerian for Ham, Cush, and Nimrod of the Bible, ruled in succession until about 3100 BC. Now, this period in Mesopotamian history is known as the Uruk expansion. And although it's usually dated to the time period I mentioned, it actually was a second phase of an earlier period of worldwide expansion which took place during the Ubaid period. And during the Uruk period, enclaves were established in Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and possibly across the Mediterranean Sea for the purposes of importing precious metals and resources into Mesopotamia. Because the hunger for gold and copper in Mesopotamia at this time period was insatiable among the elites. And this expanded the economic horizon of what archaeologists refer to as the Uruk world system. And the Uruk world system was a debt-based model designed to regulate valuable resources and commerce, and it granted immense power to the banking class. Now, the northern and western settlements functioned as the middlemen in the network, connecting resources to ancient Mesopotamia. And another area where forwarding agents circulated important resources into Mesopotamia was the Caucasus region. Now, in the Caucasus, powerful chiefs emerged, and they instituted their own royal lineages and exploited their position in this Uruk world system because they were the agents who forwarded precious resources back into the power center. Eventually, they began participating in a cult of the dead, which entailed the interment of chiefly lineages in large conical burial mounds, sometimes called kurgans in the regions. Now, in the steppe and the Caucasus, these lineages formed cultures based around rank, and this rank was linked to prestige goods. And two cultural entities associated with this are the Maikop and Yamnaya cultures. And the Yamnaya culture, which occupied the region from around the Ural Mountains to the Danube River in the west, has been dated back as far as 4500 to 4000 BC. And this Yamnaya culture buried their elite dead in subsurface tombs, sometimes covered in red ochre beneath burial mounds. And some of the elite burials that have been excavated from these kurgans have been described as colossal in size. And these were the elite who were controlling the trade routes in the region. And this was actually the point in history when the concept of royalty or chieftains entered Europe. But at the same time, in the Western Mediterranean, colonists there were attempting to replicate the urbanized landscape of Mesopotamia. This was happening in prehistoric Iberia, where several Chalcolithic megasites emerged, probably due to the presence of the copper mines. And recent DNA tests, which were conducted on remains from El Mirador Cave in Spain, have demonstrated that this Neolithic period saw a mass movement of people with Near Eastern mitochondrial DNA into the Iberian Peninsula. And Christian Christensen, who's a professor at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, he's described these colonies in Spain and Portugal as attempts to carry out a Near Eastern state formation presumably by elites who were filling a similar position to those forwarding agents from the Caucasus. Now, this time period saw the beginning of organized warfare under chiefly command in the regions of Anatolia and the Caucasus. It also marked the beginning of institutionalized heredity and inequality, and it spread the concept of slavery from the East into the Eurozone. In other words, the elitism and the concept of royalty began at this point in history. Now, it's really interesting to note that the most powerful Mesopotamian king of this period was Enmerkar. And according to the Hebrew text of Genesis chapter 10, Enmerkar, who's known as Nimrod in the Bible, was a Gibborim. And that term Gibborim denotes the offspring of the ancient Nephilim, who are the giants of biblical history. Now, the Bible records that Nimrod's uncle, Canaan, settled in the area of Asia Minor, including Lebanon, Turkey, Syria, and the Levant. The sons of Canaan began building up local states during the Uruk period, which became the great cities of Byblos, Sidon, and Jericho in world history. Now, this is the region where, according to the Bible, the Israelites encountered entire nations of giants in their struggle to reclaim the Promised Land, and that's famously recorded in the book of Joshua. And there are in this region, to the present day, extensive conical burial mounds and megalithic structures, which originate from this time period and then also after. And these can be found in the Negev Desert, the Jordan, Israel, and even Syria. In fact, Syria is one of the most heavily megalithic sites in the world. And these sites were built by these lineages of chiefs from ancient Mesopotamia. Now, the original proto-dynastic culture of ancient Egypt was also the product of this Mesopotamian expansion. In the 1890s, Flinders Petrie discovered the remains of the pre-dynastic race of Egypt at the Nakata II site in Egypt. And the earliest pottery, tombs, and writing was distinctly Mesopotamian. Many of the skeletons were extraordinarily tall. They had very long crania, and these long crania are similar actually to the images of Akhenaten that have gained so much popularity in recent years.
Mm-hmm.
And these pre-dynastic Egyptians appeared between 4500 and 3200 BC as a part of the Uruk world system expansion, and their leader is recorded in the scriptures as Mizraim, another family member or uncle of King Enmerkar. Now, at the back of the cemetery of the royal kings at Abydos, where Egyptians believed the god Osiris was buried, there are a series of tombs from this pre-dynastic period, and they consist of small burial mounds where the kings of Dynasty Zero were buried. And these burial mounds covered subsurface tombs made with mud brick chambers. Now, scholars believe that these mounds may actually represent the concept of the primordial mound from the abyss that you find in Egyptian mythology and the creation myth. But these mounds, along with the creation myth, are probably imported from the practices of the cult of the dead from the island of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf. So, this cultural tradition of burial mounds was established by individuals that were moving around the world under this Uruk expansion. Now, at around 3100 BC, during the reign of King Enmerkar, the Uruk system collapsed. And it's not surprising that it collapsed because that's what happens to every debt-based economy.
Mm-hmm.
The major enclaves at that point are rapidly abandoned in the archaeological record. And areas which were once integrated into the Uruk world system, such as ancient Byblos, Sidon, and pre-dynastic Egypt, began taking on their own nationalism and formulating their own city-states. Now, this collapse has actually been detected throughout Neolithic societies around the world, and archaeologists are up in arms at how to describe it, but it's been defined as an ecological or economic collapse. And it is always placed as occurring between 3000 and 3100 BC. And this event, where a globalizing empire based in ancient Mesopotamia experiences a massive collapse, is recorded in the Bible as the fall of the Tower of Babel. And the next event which occurs in the scriptures after the collapse of this central power base is that the elites are scattered abroad upon the face of the earth. And that's exactly what happened after the collapse of the Uruk world system. At that point, the Yamnaya culture migrated into northeastern Europe. And this migration occurred between 3000 and 2800 BC, and they carved out their own territories and became known as the corded ware culture in modern terminology. And corded ware culture continued the process of burying their elite dead under conical burial mounds, sometimes with red ochre, in subsurface tombs or log tombs. And recent DNA tests have proven that the corded ware mound builders were colonists of this earlier Yamnaya culture. And at the same time, from out of the Iberian region, the Bell Beaker people migrated in a massive expansion into Western Europe. Now, the Bell Beaker people are credited with introducing metallurgy into Ireland and Britain, and they practiced elite burials beneath a variety of round conical mounds. And they also continued the megalithic traditions established during the Neolithic period, including the construction of large circular hinges, as well as the renovation of earthworks that were already built. And the initial appearance of these individuals in Western Europe is dated to between 3000 and 2500 BC. And they also appear in North Africa, Sicily, and France at this time. Now, the Isle of Iberia origin for the Bell Beaker peoples recently been confirmed through studies of tooth morphology in thousands of their burials. And the Bell Beaker people moved throughout Europe from the west as far east as Hungary, and in the Rhinelands they encountered the corded ware culture. And probably because both had ultimately come from the ancient East, they merged their cultures into what archaeologists refer to as the zoned Beaker group, which covered the entire territory of what today is called the European Union. And there are several cultures which emerge in the early Bronze Age from out of this group, including the Wessex culture in Britain, dated to 2000 BC, the Unidis culture in Poland, Germany, and the Czech Republic at about 2300 BC. And following the Bronze Age, the descendants of these individuals on into the Iron Age were responsible for the Hallstatt and Latin cultures, and these are the Celts identified in history by the Roman historians. And so all these groups perpetuated the tradition of burial mounds for the elite dead and the construction of monumental earthworks for a period that lasts for over 2,000 years. Now, this history demonstrates that these mound-building cultures were of an ultimately common origin. And they have all, at different time periods, been found to have had gigantic or otherwise anomalous elites among them. And their ancient expansions, if we look at the record of where they're found, of where their cultures are, these are the precise regions where mythology tells us giants and demigods existed.
Very interesting. That's pretty incredible right there, what you just read.
Well, the most incredible thing about what I just told you is this is all on record. Mm-hmm. There's nothing that I just went over with you that you can't detect in mainstream archaeology.
Right. And Jason, we're going to have a break. Everybody stay tuned. We'll be right back here at Ravenstar's Witching Hour. My special guest is Jason Jarrell.